Welcome to this episode, sponsored by Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence. Thank you, Thomas Jefferson. In this episode, we'll be taking a look at what life was like in the early 1800s at the turn of the century. We'll also be taking a look at Jefferson's administration as President of the United States. And as you can see by the map of growing America here, not only were we expanding our territory when Jefferson purchases the Louisiana Territory from the French in 1803, something we'll get into here in just a little bit, but we also see that our population is increasing. And it's the main reason for that is basically through natural reproduction. And as we were getting more people, we were looking to move west of the Appalachians more, and eventually out to, claim new lands and start new lives. But as this population increases in its numbers, we do see the start of regional identities. People kind of start looking at themselves as Northerners, Southerners, and maybe Westerners. And as people do move west, we see the creation of new cities like Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, because we'll have these new cities popping up primarily along rivers, because rivers will be a cheap, easy source of transportation, both of people and of products. And as people moved west, a lot of times they transplanted their customs with them. If there were farmers from the north, they tended to be farmers as they moved west. Large plantation owners in the south, if they moved westward, would create large plantations as they went. And so you try to make things as familiar as possible. But needless to say, agriculture does remain as America's top export, something that Jefferson supported all along. But with the newly invented cotton gin by Eli Whitney, slavery becomes much more profitable, and therefore it creates a higher demand of slaves. And as people claim new land to try to have these plantations, slavery will be moving westward with them. However, what we do see developing during this time is kind of an economic diversification. We do see that Samuel Slater, who's kind of known as the father of manufacturing, created one of the first textile mills in New England. And as you would expect, it opened along the rivers as they proved to be a good source of power for various types of mills. We also see Robert Fulton in 1807 launched the Clermont, the first successful steamboat up the Hudson River. Now, rivers truly were the interstate highway systems of their day. They were the easiest, cheapest means of transportation. Now, transporting them down a river was very easy, but it wasn't until these steamboats that transporting goods upriver became just as easy and profitable. So both these inventions will kind of start to kind of revolutionize the way that America does business. Now, even though people still lived pretty much in the countryside, and the urban population was quite small, probably roughly 7% of the nation's population lived in the cities. Cities served primarily as depots of goods, not as hubs for producing goods. So Slater's invention with the textile mills are just in their infancy here. However, we now turn our attention to Thomas Jefferson. And as we had looked at earlier in the election of 1800, it was actually the first time in our nation's history that we had turned political power over from one party to another, as it went from the hands of the Federalists and John Adams to Thomas Jefferson and the Democrat Republicans. Hence, this is why it's known as the Peaceful Revolution. Now, in 1800, Jefferson, as kind of a states' rights activist, takes control, and he has the support of the southern states. And with that, the Three-Fifths Compromise helped Jefferson defeat Adams, because without the Three-Fifths Compromise, chances are there wouldn't have been enough electoral votes there to help him win the presidency. But even with that fact, at this time, roughly 20% of the United States population was made up of slaves. And at this point, Thomas Jefferson actually wanted the slave trade outlawed, which, if you think about it, how a man of his status and stature and great wealth, living in an era where slavery was widely acceptable, how did he become, under the belief that slavery should be outlawed? He was just kind of ahead of his time in that way. But with the Democrat Republicans and Thomas Jefferson winning the election of 1800, an atmosphere of political panic struck for the Federalists. And therefore, John Adams kind of looked at how he could perhaps try to keep the Federalists in power some way. And being that they were losing control of the presidency and Congress, he looked at the judicial branch. And on his last day in office, he actually appoints 42 judges to federal positions, and they become known as the Midnight Judges. However, Jefferson doesn't want to commission these new Federalist judges, and so he instructs his Secretary of State, James Madison, who you see on the right there, he instructs him not to send out and authorize their new appointments. Well, eventually, a lawsuit is brought forth, and one of the lead complainants is William Marbury, the man in the middle on your screen there. And this court case becomes known as Marbury versus Madison, probably one of the most important Supreme Court decisions in our nation's history. And the ruling was handed down by John Marshall, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he goes a long ways in strengthening the judicial branch, kind of really putting it at an even keel with the other two branches, the executive and legislative branches. But in this Marbury versus Madison decision, he does issue that it's probably rightful that they do get these commissions, but that it's not the court's job to instruct the president or to hand them out themselves. And so what Marshall does do basically is kind of establish what we call judicial review. And it strengthens the Supreme Court because it does kind of recognize that the Supreme Court does have the final say in all constitutional matters. And therefore, with the ushering in of Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republican Party, we move away from the Federalist Party and a strong central government to one of a states' rights, smaller federal government belief. Jefferson also hoped to lower taxes, he hoped to lower the federal debt, and he hoped to just basically shrink the size of government in general. He sought to cut military spending and was also distrustful of large standing armies and wanted to cut the size of the military for those reasons. However, even with the military cuts, he does create West Point to train future military leaders. Jefferson also believed that there was opportunity there for everyone. As we had talked about before, he had favored an agricultural-based economy, even though that begins to change under him a little bit. And he doesn't trust the banks, and he dislikes the big cities as they can be corrupting and kind of cesspools full of disease and overcrowding. But his belief in states' rights and a smaller government kind of helped lead some of his administrative beliefs. Luckily for Jefferson, however, his cuts in the military didn't affect the outcome of the Barbary War. From 1801 to 1805, the U.S. was engaged in a military conflict on the northern coast of Africa and the Mediterranean Sea. What had happened was pirates of the Mediterranean were raiding ships and demanding tribute from nations, the United States and Europe and whatnot. Jefferson wasn't going to be willing to pay tribute to these pirates anymore, as some of the European nations continued to do so. And so what happens is he sends over our military and instills a naval blockade and sends the troops ashore with the famous battle at Tripoli taking place in 1804. But after a period of time, Jefferson's actions pay off, and he is able to make the pirates stop their demands for tribute. During his presidency, Jefferson also had the opportunity to purchase the Louisiana Territory from the French, who had gained control of that area from the Spanish. And being that Napoleon Bonaparte was kind of needing money to help him in his war against the British, he had kind of given up on his goal of colonies and worldwide empire. And so in 1803, James Monroe was sent to negotiate the purchase of what was originally New Orleans. And Thomas Jefferson had sent him over there to try to secure that city because it was the mouth of the Mississippi. And whoever controlled that ensured that the Mississippi would stay open. Now, we didn't want the French closing it down. However, once Monroe is sent over and negotiates with Napoleon, eventually Napoleon's willing to sell his whole Louisiana territory to the United States for $15 million. And it works out to be quite a bargain of a deal for the United States, nearly doubling the size of the U.S. Now, with this purchase, which Jefferson wasn't even sure if it was constitutional, he eventually sends out the Lewis and Clark expedition. And as they leave St. Louis in May of 1804, they take their party out, come in contact with many different varieties of new animals and plant life, not to mention the numerous Native American tribes. And eventually they return in September of 1806 with this wealth of knowledge of mapping the area and coming in contact with different people and kind of seeing what's out there and what exactly it was that they bought. But the question then came up is, what do you do with the Native Americans? Whereas Americans are eventually going to want to move westward into this territory, how would the Native American relations turn out? And even though Jefferson may have respected the Native Americans, he wasn't too impressed with their culture, but the fact remained that they still lived there and eventually would come in more contact with the Americans. And finally, with the French and the British still at war in the Napoleonic Wars, Jefferson tried to avoid involvement in all the European wars that were going on. And with that, there were still things that were kind of dragging us closer to possible war, whether it be our freedom of the seas were being violated, our USS Chesapeake had been attacked by the British. Many people started calling for more drastic measures to try to defend American sovereignty. And eventually, therefore, Congress passes the embargo of 1807, which is kind of an idea of what's along the lines of what's called peaceable coercion, basically using economics as a diplomatic weapon. Basically, we're saying we weren't going to trade with the French or British until they stopped violating our rights at sea and kind of leaving us free to trade with either country. However, the warhawks like Henry Clay on the bottom there and John C. Calhoun on the top picture weren't happy with this, and they wanted more forceful measures, kind of take a more militaristic approach to defending our rights at sea and American sovereignty, as they weren't happy with the fact that our sailors were being impressed into the British Navy. They didn't think peaceful coercion would work, and in fact some of these warhawks even looked at possible invasion up into Canada and kind of annexing them into the United States. But in the long run, Jefferson kind of steers the path of neutrality, but actually his embargo hurt the United States economy more than it helped us. As you can see here by this chart, the value of not just our imports but our exports fell dramatically after the embargo was put in place. So it really hurt our own manufacturing. It hurt our vessels that would ship goods back and forth, and really his foreign policy kind of did more harm than good for the United States. And we'll take a look at eventually, though, in our next lesson, what eventually does drag us into the War of 1812.